I'm Carolyn Steel, and I'm an architect by training, but I now talk and write about food and its relationship to cities, and particularly to the way we live in general. I was an architect and I was also teaching in Cambridge University and elsewhere, and became very interested in cities and really sort of how cities work and what makes a city work.
Food could be a really interesting way of trying to understand what a city was. This is my favourite slide. You can see a city on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you can see a beautifully crafted landscape, olive groves, vineyards, and so on. You can see people working away very hard in the fields. You can see a group of huntsmen leaving the city, presumably to go and shoot a boar or something for dinner. You can see pigs wandering into the city. It's all about food. Why didn't I see that before? And just inside the city gate, you see two asses with grain on their backs, bringing grain into the city, and a flock of sheep wandering around and so on. Food is kind of travelling backwards and forwards between the city and the countryside.
And it struck me that, the kind of conversation that architects tend to have about cities, for very understandable reasons, all tends to focus around buildings and public spaces maybe, and possibly, if you're lucky, how a street works. And I just thought, well, wouldn't it be amazing to try to describe a city through food? And as I started realising how enormous this subject was, I also sort of started thinking, well, it's also really weirdly obvious. Why haven't I thought about all this stuff before? Of course a city's food has to come from somewhere else.
Where is this food coming from, and how are we physically bringing it into the city? All cities that were founded before the motor car are profoundly shaped by food, and you can actually trace the way food was arriving in the city. And if you look at where the food was coming in from, of course, ocean-going vessels bringing the food up the river to the dam, which was where the Amstel was dammed. And of course, that is the main place where the grain was traded, and also where the fish was coming in. Not all cities followed that model. If that's model A, if you like, Rome was model B, it kind of went the other way. Instead of saying, yes, we're going to feed ourselves from a sort of little patch of farmland outside, they basically built a navy and went off somewhere else in search for food. So Rome had about 1 million population by the 1st century AD, and the question is, how did a city like that feed itself in the ancient world? And the answer is ancient food miles. So you may have heard of food miles and think they're a modern phenomenon, and of course they are really sort of radicalised now, but they are not new. The only way a city the size of Rome could have fed itself was by getting its food from overseas.
But as those settlements get bigger, the problem of how to feed them gets bigger too. And if you think of a city as a blob, and you think of its productive hinterland as the land around it, it's just pure geometry that the bigger the blob gets, the relatively smaller the sort of practicable ring around it that you can produce food from gets. So there's a limit to the size that a city can grow to.
For as long as people have been building cities, they've been saying, how on earth are we going to sustain this thing? In fact, Plato in his Ideal Republic said we have to limit the size to which a city can grow, and then if it gets too big, we have to send people off and found one somewhere else. So it's an old problem. It's never been easy feeding cities.
Food is one of those things that's too big to see. It just is everywhere. And yes, we do take it for granted. And of course, in the industrial city, it's become invisible.
Food is a bit like God, really. It's everywhere, but it's too big to see, so we just miss it.
When you look at a problem like how do you feed a city, that's like saying, how do you feed life? I mean, the question is much more simplistic than the reality. Food is as complicated as life. I often say it is such a powerful metaphor for life, you may as well call it life, So everything to do with our culture, the way we socialise, what we value or don't value, you know, sort of how we literally sort of live our day, how we build houses, streets. It's all related to food.
If we understand how profoundly food shapes our world, how can we use food as a tool to shape it better? Do we eat with one another? This is the basis of every society on earth. Or do we, as in America, eat our meals in a car? 19% of the meals in America are now eaten in a car. And my question is, how does all of that stuff feed into an understanding of what a good life is? And that really is my question.
I suppose I explore food as a lens for understanding life, and then also asking the question, how should we live?
We can use food as a tool to question what kind of society we're building, and we can also use food to mould it differently, because the beautiful thing about food, unlike utopia, is that tiny decisions that we make can make very big differences. Here is my gift to you. It's to see the world through food. Just have Sitopian glasses on and the world will see different. Thank you very much indeed.